That's a question that seems to scratch at the back of every Sunday school student's mind at some point, and it's a classic conundrum that biblical scholars have juggled with for centuries. Where does Cain's wife come from in the Bible? When you're sitting in church or when you're reading through Genesis at home in Portland, or anywhere for that matter, it's like one of those plot holes in a movie that once you see, you can't unsee. The Bible starts with Adam and Eve, tossing their sons Cain and Abel into the mix, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, Cain has a wife. It's a bit of a head-scratcher. So we look for clues in the text. After Cain kills his brother Abel and is exiled by God, the Bible in Genesis 4:17 simply states, Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. The text doesn't elaborate further on where she came from, which leads to a bit of speculation. The common answer provided by theologians is deductive reasoning. If Adam and Eve were the first human beings created by God and were the first parents, then their children would have no other human beings to marry and procreate with, except for their own siblings or perhaps nieces and nephews. It's a conclusion that sits uncomfortably with our modern sensibilities for obvious reasons. But in the context of the story, this was early on in humanity's timeline. Back then, the genetic pool would have been pristine, and the moral laws concerning incestuous relationships, as outlined later in Levitical law, had yet to be established. Some scholars argue that Adam and Eve had many more children after Cain and Abel that the Bible doesn't explicitly mention, and that over time, as this human family grew, Cain would have taken one of his sisters or a later female descendant as his wife. It's also interesting to note that the Bible often skips generations and condenses stories, so there could potentially be large gaps of time we're not privy to which allowed for a population increase sufficient for Cain to find a wife outside his immediate family. The bottom line is this. The Bible doesn't spoon-feed us every detail. Whether due to oral tradition simplifying stories before they were written, or the authors focusing on the theological point over the logistical one, we're left to stitch together the narrative with a blend of textual evidence and educated assumptions. Regardless of where Cain's wife came from, the story's focus is on other moral and spiritual lessons, ones that resonate regardless of how many people were on Earth at the time. And hey, it's these kinds of unanswered questions that keep things interesting and theologians in a job, right?